the magnetic mech stuff happening in the Boomsday project. This one was teased in a previous blog post. Looks so awesome. I can't imagine anything else being cooler than this one. And Ziliax, as you can see, a 5-mana 3/2 mech, has the magnetic keyword, of course, but also dumps quite a few other keywords here as well. Divine Shield, Taunt, Lifesteal, and Rush. So Corpse Takers are already super excited about this neutral option to buff them like crazy. But beyond that, there's really two ways to talk about this card, right? It's both as a minion itself, but also as a magnetic buff style card. So when you look at Ziliax as a minion, a 5-mana 3/2 probably doesn't excite you right off the bat. But despite that, I think there's so much stuff this card does that it might still be okay as a minion. I don't think it's fantastic, but it's probably playable in a pinch as a minion itself. I kind of think about this card like an Argent Commander with some defensive capabilities and also potential to operate as a buff as well, of course. But for 5 mana, you're getting this instantly active 3/2 minion that can take a trade into something. So it's got that Divine Shield. It can safely value trade the turn you play it. It's got Lifesteal, so it's going to heal you a little bit. It's got Taunt, so it lingers around as perhaps an awkward body, a 3/2 that causes some problems for somebody, right? So it's instant, it's defensive, and a little bit, you know, not a ton of defensive potential as a minion itself necessarily, but still can create some friction and problems for 5 mana. This thing is gonna help you stay alive for a turn or two if you're just desperate to do that. And I think it compares favorably to things like Argent Commander. It doesn't have the offensive potential of Argent Commander, but it's a mana cheaper, it's got more life gain, it's got some other potential tools. And of course, then in a mech deck, you can expand on that value by using Ziliax as a buff as well. You can magnetize him to something, which again gives you a lot of potential to work with here. So for 5 mana, if you compare it to other buffs in the game, it falls somewhere between like Blessing of Kings and Spike Ridge Steed perhaps, but again, a lot of defensive value in this buff. If you have a minion on board, it doesn't even need to have initiative, it doesn't need to be awake. You can just play a minion right alongside Ziliax, some just big dumb stat body, which we're gonna see a few of. As long as it's a mech, you cast Ziliax, that thing's gonna get rush and you can instantly heal for a ton of damage. You can instantly play a really big taunt minion. You can take a really strong value trade. Just real quickly to tease you a little bit, something like War Gear, a 5 mana 5/5 combined with Ziliax. You get this giant 8/7 thing that's healing you for 8 right away. Might heal you for even more if it takes return trades because it is a taunt. So yes, that's a 10 mana play or perhaps a 2-turn setup sort of play, but the potential's still there for this thing to make really big impacts. And because it operates so quickly and it's active and it doesn't have to sit around passively like so many cards in Hearthstone, that's usually a good sign for the playability of a card. Now, we did learn in the video that revealed Ziliax that classes getting magnetic mechs are going to be limited to Hunter, Paladin, and Warrior, so not every class is necessarily going to be able to utilize this thing successfully. Of course, there are some neutral mechs, but they probably won't have enough tools to make the magnetic aspect of Ziliax competitive enough to really carve out a space in a given deck. So I don't think anybody's going to want to run this as a minion specifically, but nonetheless, if you have to play it as a minion in a mech deck, I think it's okay. It's a reasonable play. Not a good one, just a reasonable one. And then, of course, the potential for this thing as a buff and an activation and just stacking up all kinds of crazy mech value in a mech deck means it's going to be played in any sort of deck that relies on magnetism that goes for that mech line, of which I assume one will probably be somewhat competitive at the very least. Generally, Blizzard doesn't design an entire multi-class mechanic that fails, although that said, they kind of did with hand buffing in the past for the same 3 classes, so who knows, it may not stick. But I think since it's the theme of the expansion, they're gonna tweak the power levels to make something like Ziliax a relevant and important card in those environments. So that said, I think this is a solid card, not an amazing card, but certainly has the potential to be played, can operate in a few different ways. Works instantly, which is very important for cards that want to work well in Hearthstone, has defensive potential, has value trades, all of the stuff you might like. So I'm pretty high on Ziliax. I think this is a neat little mech and a cool looking centerpiece. I do wish the stats were a little bigger, of course, because he looks so big and awesome, but nonetheless, a card that I'm pretty fond of. So now let's move on and talk about some of the builder style mechs, the mechs that are gonna be the core building blocks for magnetized decks. Up first here we have the upgradable frame bot, a 2-mana 1/5, and you can see here he's a tiny little guy, but he's already got one upgrade apparently with this giant arm. That kind of makes him look like he should be a 5/1, but perhaps that arm can only be used defensively. That's like a big shield arm, and he's punching with the tiny little arm on the other side. Who knows? But the idea here is this is the perfect base to magnetize with other minions. You drop your Ziliax on this thing, and suddenly you've got a 4/7 rush, divine shield, taunt, lifesteal minion. That's kind of crazy. That's a really good 7-mana minion. That stacks a lot of stuff together. And more importantly, I think, than that is that upgradable framebot is something that you can play on turn 2, perhaps even turn 1 with the coin, and it's almost guaranteed to survive. It's so difficult for decks to kill a 5 health minion that early in the game. So if you're playing a more aggressive or more mid-range style of a mech deck, which I assume most of them will be more mid-rangey based on what we've seen thus far, this just gives you that base where on turn 3, you're pretty much guaranteed to have something there for your magnetic play if you want to make it. So it's just this perfect follow-up, and then if they can't answer that, you've got to follow up on turn 4, and you start building this stackable resource. Now eventually that would become susceptible to silence, but there are all kinds of different ways you can play these magnetic minions. You can split your resources as necessary, but it's just a good start. And that's going to be really important for these decks, I think, to snowball into any sort of advantage and give them the necessary options. Also, even if you get this thing in the late game, like I said, combining it with something like Ziliax on turn 7, if you draw an upgradable framebot on turn 7, that's fine. You're just going to be able to stack those stats right in, and because Ziliax has rush, upgradable framebot becomes instantly activated, which is nice. You get to put those stats into play immediately. Now, of course, this card itself does not have magnetic, so you can't use this as a follow-up. It's going to have to be something that you play down first and magnetize if you like. That's a little bit of a downside, but ultimately, as long as your deck has a nice balance there of enough magnetic stuff and enough faces, I don't think that's going to be a problem. The value of this card as an early game deterrent, an early game survivability tool that builds on everything else, that's where this thing succeeds. Not to mention the fact that a 1/5 minion right now isn't terrible as we see Hearthstone. With all the odd paladins out there, this thing can eat lots and lots of silver-handed fruit, so that's not too bad either. So clearly an important piece for the magnetic puzzle. I think this is going to absolutely be played if a magnetic deck finds any sort of success at all. And in fact, I think this card will be an important foundation towards magnetic mech decks actually seeing play. I don't think they'd work nearly as well without these sorts of minions to build on. So I think this card is really, really good. It may not look exciting or strong. It's not going to win you games on its own necessarily, but it's one of those fundamental pieces that supports this archetype that we're going to see, hopefully, in the Boomsday Project, so a really strong card. And then up next here, we have another neutral mech. This is the War Gear, another super cool mech design, by the way. These mech artists are knocking it out of the park as far as I'm concerned. This guy is a 5-mana 5/5 mech, and he simply has the keyword magnetic. So whereas we saw a building block with the previous card, the upgradable framebot, now I think we're seeing one of those follow-ups. This is a card that can theoretically be a building block. You can play this down as a 5-mana 5/5. Clearly not the most exciting play in Hearthstone, but in a pinch, it's a serviceable minion that might lead into a Ziliax on turn 6, for instance, to give you something big and crazy. So the flexibility here, very important for this card finding success. That's very, very nice. And other times it's like this, bigger Blessing of Kings, essentially. A 5-mana 5/5 buff on a minion that's on board. And, Blessing of Kings is a really solid card. And if you can hit an upgradable framebot with a War Gear, suddenly you have a 6/10 minion, and that's really big and scary. Now, it's not a game-winning play necessarily. It's not the kind of thing that's going to go toe-to-toe with a control deck. But if you build this in a mid-range environment, you're able to apply that pressure, continually stack up your minions, you've got a nice threat. So War Gear's flexibility is great. Its combination with other mechs is strong. It's a Blessing of Kings card sometimes, otherwise just a minimal status minion. The downside there is that it just doesn't do anything super exciting. Sometimes it'll feel like just a weak play. You're on turn 5 and you just have to play a 5/5. You're not going to be all that excited about that sort of play. So I don't think this card's going to blow anything out of the water. By no means a 5-star card that's going to be deck defining or archetype defining. Just one of those puzzle pieces you put in there. It works some of the time. It's fine some of the time. It's good. It's got comparisons to favorable cards. Certainly nothing wrong with this card. It's just a card that'll be tossed into mech decks as needed when they need to fill in that mana spot. This thing looks like a suitable fit. So a good card, solid card, just not an amazing card in my mind. And then up next here we have a Warrior, the first class specific of the magnetized mechs we're seeing in this review. This is the Beryllium Nullifier, a 7-mana 3/8 mech. This guy has magnetic as well, and he also has the can't be targeted keyword, if you will. So not getting hit by spells or hero powers anytime soon. Now, I will say I think this is the weakest of the mechs that we've seen so far. The problem with Beryllium Nullifier for me is just that he has a very, very high cost total. 7 mana is a lot. When you're looking at cards that have that nice flexibility of being a minion or a buff, and when you're looking at playing multiple things together to utilize all of those buffs in a single turn, as you creep up that mana cost, it seems like they're going to be harder and harder to fit into a given turn or to play with some flexibility. So for instance, you can't play Beryllium Nullifier and Ziliax together on the same turn. You could if you got to 10 mana and had 2 5-drops. That's a fine thing. You could do that. Beryllium Nullifier, you just don't have that option. So if you're using this as a magnetic attachment, as a buff, most of the time it's probably only going to happen if you had something on board already. Now, obviously those instances will occur in mech decks. The question is that additional buff gonna make the card way, way, way better? And of course, gaining 8 health and gaining a can't be targeted keyword are both really good at keeping a minion alive, but there are still a lot of problems there. The minion is still very susceptible to single target removal with like battle cries, like Valspine Slayer, still very susceptible to full board clears and wipes like Twisting Nethers, still susceptible to silence. Silence can really work through these sorts of things. Not to mention the Beryllium Nullifier itself doesn't actually have like taunt, so it's not going to make that minion defensive. So if you know you have this one big stacked minion on board, your opponent is playing a wide base deck and they're trying to kill you, what do? You buff your guy, but you're just kind of sitting there with a big tall minion that your opponent ignores. And like, yes, maybe you can hit them in the face for 10 damage because you've stacked up a big mech, or maybe you take some trades, but just one Righteous Protector or something is going to completely stall out this sort of play. So without giving this some sort of really immediate impact, I just don't know why Beryllium Nullifier is going to be good. When I compare this to something like Spike Ridge Steed, for instance, as a buff, you know, that's a 2/6 buff that has a defensive element. It has a death rattle that feeds back in as well as another defensive element, and it gives it that stickiness and that survivability aspect, and that's what makes Spike Ridge Steed so good. Beryllium Nullifier just doesn't have that. It's not all that different from a stat standpoint, and it doesn't have taunt. So I just don't know who wants to use this and why. Are you trying to keep a minion alive desperately so you value the can't be targeted? Are you wanting to play a 3/8 minion on turn 7? Because when you think about this as a minion, I would say it's as equally unexciting. It is a base you can build on with future mechs, but that's probably going to happen a turn later. Ultimately, I think it all just comes back to that mana cost, and that really scares me, and it just seems like it's going to be awkward and hard to fit this thing into turns and fit it into decks in a way that makes a lot of sense. So there are certain elements here you can pick out that are positive about this card. I'm not saying it's completely unplayable. There might be some deck or environment that somehow squeezes this thing in or makes it fit, or there's some specific combination with like a 3-mana mech that's perfect. But ultimately, it feels like this isn't very good as a follow-up. It isn't very good as an independent minion. It's not that good as a buff in the first place, and it's only good in specific sort of single minion plays, and those seem so darn susceptible and probably not all that good. The Beryllium Nullifier doesn't have the same sort of flexibility that the rest of these magnetic mechs have, making it to me the weakest one we've seen so far. and probably just a tad too awkward to ever really see much playable. So now let's move beyond the mechs into some cards. I hadn't talked about previously. These are a few days older. I didn't want to do a review for just 1 or 2 cards. I've been holding on to these. Up first is the Menacing Nimbus, a new Shaman Elemental minion. 2 mana, 2/2 Battlecry. Add a random elemental to your hand. And when it comes to Menacing Nimbus, this is just like the most okay card ever. I don't think this card is gonna ever change Hearthstone or completely redefine a deck or create some new reason to play Elemental Shaman, but of course it's totally fine. 2 mana, 2/2s, an okay stat line. That's fine to get you moving onto the board. The battle cry is more value oriented as opposed to tempo or board oriented, so that shifts the design of the deck a little bit more towards a longer game, or at the very least a more mid-rangey style as opposed to an aggressive style, so that's important. So in other words, it's more Servant of Kalamos than it is Blaze Caller, right? It's more about adding resources to your hand as opposed to affecting the board immediately. So that's sometimes good for Shaman, sometimes bad depending upon the design of the deck, but clearly a more value-oriented Shaman deck could do that, and occasionally you're going to hit Kalamos off this. You're going to be super pumped that you got an extra Kalamos. Occasionally you're going to hit Firefly, and you're probably okay with that, but it's really not the best play in the world. So that Babbling Book kind of line just upgraded a little bit here into 2 mana. And random elementals, are they better than random mage spells? Some of the time, sure. If your deck is synergizing, that's great. Having cheap elementals is really good to keep the elemental chains going at any given turn. And of course, adding elementals to your hand does the same thing. Helps you keep up the consistency of your elemental activation. So, you know, the kind of card that's going to be great in Arena just to get things rolling and keep your hand full of good stuff. Less exciting and constructed, but certainly still very playable. Imagine this being played in any Shaman deck. Even if it's not elemental, it's just a fine card. Anything would be happy to see this. It's okay. It's not amazing. Just really, really good, fine, solid Hearthstone card. So this one will see some level of play somewhere along the line. And then finally, one last card here. This is Stargazer Luna, the Mage Legendary Minion, a scientist for Dr. Boom. This is a 3 mana 2/4 with a pretty neat effect. After you play the rightmost card in your hand, you draw a card. So this card, it's been out for a while. You probably had a lot of time to think about this one. I'll try to keep it relatively short. Play Stargazer Luna onto the board. Whatever the rightmost card into your hand is, you play that, and she draws you a new card. And then if you can play that new card instantly, she's going to draw you another card. And if you can play that card instantly, she's going to draw you another card. So you get into this essentially top deck chain that if you're able to keep playing your top deck card, Stargazer Luna is going to create some ridiculous amounts of value by adding card after card after card to your hand, and sometimes perhaps creating lots and lots of damage potential. Because if you build your deck in the right way, and you run a lot of low-cost cards, particularly those that are easily played at any given moment, Stargazer Luna could chain into lots and lots of cards. And frankly, looking at the card as a 3 mana 2/4, that's an okay 3 mana stat line. Certainly not great. 3/4 would be the staple standard. But really, if you just get one card off Stargazer Luna, it's not a bad play necessarily. Like, that would be if it was just a 3 mana 2/4 that said draw a card, that'd be something you'd run in a lot of mage decks. That'd be very strong, and it's just a consistent, cheap card draw that gets you moving in the early game. As she starts to draw 2 or 3, or God forbid even 4 cards, Stargazer Luna is off the charts good. That's completely crazy. The problem, of course, is that that's not always going to work. First off, there's some weirdness with lining up the initial Stargazer Luna turn, because you might not have a cheap card on the right-hand side of your deck, and you may not have the ability to combo together 3 mana with whatever that card costs. Alternatively, if your deck runs anything that's relatively expensive, as you start to get into 4 mana, 5 mana cards, it becomes really hard to play those top decks and chain out those top decks. So your Stargazer Luna could backfire pretty often, and there could also be instances where she's just sitting in your hand while you're waiting for the right turn to play her. That said, if you build, a burn mage that just runs a ton of cheap stuff, even thinking about a deck like Murloc Mage, which is a very fringe playable deck right now in Hearthstone, it would probably be a good fit. You have a ton of cheap Murlocs, you have some cheap spells, and you could just keep moving things together. Play a 1 mana Murloc, play a 2 mana Murloc, play a Frostbolt, play a 1 mana Murloc. and you could build this board and just keep refilling your hand. So if the deck is structured in the exact right way, there are going to be big hitting turns for Stargazer Luna. It'll be that sort of extra Alaneth in your deck that just draws you a ton of stuff, but at least in a little bit more of a controlled fashion. So I could see this making the cut in that kind of deck. Is this going to make it into every mage deck? No, I don't think so. The downside, the risk is too high. Well, it's not really a risk, but at least the lack of upside is too high. Often this would just be an average, mediocre sort of play, and other times the opportunity cost would be too strong because she's just a dead card or sitting awkwardly, or you can't really find a time to play her. Now, I will say that a card like this is something that has a sort of soft taunt. In other words, your opponent feels very compelled to kill it, and that can be a nice tool as well in a deck like that if they have to kill your Stargazer Luna instead of, say, like a Murdlock Tidecaller that has 3 or 4 attack, and you can use that to snowball. So, clearly some great things happening in this card. I think it does have potential. I just think not every deck's going to run it. It's going to be hard to find the right fit. It may not happen right away, but somewhere down the line, somebody's going to make this thing crazy, and it's going to be frustrating because you're going to draw like 6 cards against you, and they're just going to like Frostbolt you, Arcane Missiles, Frostbolt, Arcane Missiles, Fireball you for the win because of Stargazer Luna, and that's going to be a highlight. I'm sure it'll happen to me on day 1, so keep an eye out for the YouTube clips of that. Nonetheless, the kind of card that, again, not the best card we've seen, but a playable, reasonable Hearthstone card that will find it. And there you go, guys. That's it for part 2 of my Boomsday Project detailed reviews. Now what I'd like to do is run through each of these and give them a rating from 1 to 5 stars in my quick reviews. Ziliax is a 4-star card. Upgradable Freembot is a 4-star card. War Gear is a 3-star card. Beryllium Nullifier is a 2-star card. Menacing Nimbus is a 3-star card. Stargazer Luna is a 3-star card. And there you have it, guys. What do you think? Are mechs gonna make the cut? Is Magnetic a cool enough keyword to see play? Is Ziliax good or terrible? What do you think about Stargazer Luna? Share all those thoughts in the comments below. Tell me how I'm wrong. Tell me how I'm right. All of your insights. You guys always have lots and lots of cool things to say. But until then, thank you so much as always for watching. And until next time, game on.
Mushroom power! The battle is over. You win.
We're back. So, we don't have, constantly ourselves echoing in our heads anymore. That was the mechanic from the last set, echo. We didn't want to have echo in this set.
I think it was a little bit of magnetic interference with the headphones.
Exactly.
It was a problem.
But we got things figured out now, so we can get things back on track. And so, about the sort of overall theme of the project, it's really about mad science, right?
Yeah, it's all about science. We're taking all the different types. So we've got Gloop Science in the Druid Lab. That's biology. Or rogues are messing with chemistry and poisons and all sorts of crazy gases. There's all sorts of stuff going on in Boob Labs, and each of these 9 labs is run by one of 9 legendary scientists.
Okay.
And
we've seen one of them.
Absolutely.
And I imagine maybe we'll see another one today.
Well,
This is
take a look.
good.
All right. Well, is it about time to...
Way beyond the other stuff.
Yeah, let's get started.
All right. So, our very first card of the real steam.
Reporting for light the bonfire.
This is a legendary spell.
Yep.
Kangor's Endless Army. Resurrect
That didn't go as
yeah. They keep any magnetic upgrade. So normally when you have any kind of effect that resurrects something, you bring it back to life.
The battle! The battle!
You eternal servitude your Prophet Valen. Well, he's Prophet Valen. So like a Prophet Valen if you played that Valen's chosen on him. So I'll take Valen and Valen differently. Each of those different cards. I just realized that I do that when I tried to say both of them in the same sentence, but maybe I'll do that differently in the future. But this one, yeah, so if you're playing a mech deck and you want to make big mech minions,
The battle!
crazy.
Yeah, you get a War Gear and a Ziliax, another War Gear, and then you just get to bring them all back. And you get to bring back 3, so it's interesting trying to figure out.
You're gonna turn the fucking line off?
Your mech's buffs. Do you play them to the side? How wide do you want to go?
Zilliax
giant
still up.
Zilliax, yeah.
All right.
Zilliax plus war gear, it looks like.
Surrender imminent.
Too soon. Too soon. It's like a year ago, but still too soon.
Get in there. Fight. The battle.
Right.
The battle. The battle. The battle.
I'll be making his armor.
I hope so.
Or do you just brawl the board? This is the same animation, I think. This is still the brawl.
We're just gonna brawl. Brawl animation's cool.
It is.
It's true, just gonna keep the watching.
Mech wins the
Then we got a dinosaur.
Surrender imminent. Who will be purged?
Prepare.
Never mind.
There it is.
There it is.
The battle.
We made it.
The battle. The battle.
Yeah,
The
we're gonna
battle.
resurrect friendly mechs. Keep any mechanic.
Did you watch the other shows?
There's no other show.
No.
What's the door? Juicy cool.
Behold the might of Storm. Who will be purged?
Repent.
It is very good. The battle. The battle. The battle.
To get the buffs, just message it a little bit, yeah. But
That's the Paladin legendary cell.
it is, yeah. They're doing like laser science in the Paladin lab.
Who will be purged?
This is Kangor, leader of the Paladin.
Reporting for
He's
duty.
Elizabeth Kangor. He's the
Okay.
Paladin legendary scientist, and
All right.
we'll see him someday.
Not today, though.
Not today.
All right. Well, now we know the kind of stuff he does, so you got something to look forward to.
Yeah. Let's take a look at the
The
next card.
poor don't bother me.
Dead.
A 2/1
Reporting for duty. Who will be purged?
death minion. Now, this is the sort of card that
Reporting
I
for
think
duty.
decks
The
that
battle. The battle.
playing a deck like West, you want that and also you sometimes in long games, unless you're playing Benedictus, and nowadays I basically always play Benedictus.
Of course.
You run the risk with your Twilight's Calls of bringing back card draw minions late in the game when you are deep in fatigue already, and it makes those cards kind of weak later on. Whereas if say this replaced Loot Hoarder in your deck,
Yep.
this guarantees that you get a card that can help advance your quest. And late in the game, you don't run the risk of I can't afford to cast my Twilight's Call because I'm going to go deeper into fatigue.
Yep, absolutely. And if you want both of them, you can play Loot Hoarder and Dead
Right,
Ringer.
even more. Right, it gives you additional copies of those cheap death rattles to play for that. You also could play this in not necessarily a quest deck, but a deck that cares about having particular death rattle minions. Say you're playing a deck that wants to be a Coffin Crasher deck, for instance.
Sure, yeah.
You're playing a Coffin Crasher deck, and you play a couple of these to ensure that you get your Coffin Crashers and your Obsidian Statues or other gigantic death rattle minions, so that you don't worry about not having some combo.
Just hope your Coffin Crasher doesn't pull out your Dead Ringers.
You got to play it first.
Right, of
You got to
course.
plan ahead. it costs two. So the problem with Coffin Crash in a lot of cases is when you have like mid-sized stuff.
Yeah.
It's difficult to find a place to play. You want to have like these plus Coffin Crashers plus gigantic Death Rattle minions. It's kind of a perfect sequence because you can ensure you have each of the pieces of your combo. And this is cheap enough that you can play it and get it out of your hands. You're guaranteed to get a big thing with your Coffin Crasher.
Yep, absolutely. Good with Twilight's Call. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Nice
Very, very
little
cool card.
raptors.
Is there like a Death Rattle theme, for Priest in the set in addition, or is this kind of a one-off?
A little bit. There's a little bit of a Death Rattle theme. Priests are really about cloning in this expansion.
Cloning. Okay, so like Mirage Collar type stuff.
A little bit of Mirage Collar, a little bit of like Faceless Manipulator type thing. When you look at
What's
like
their lab?
the cloning lab,
Oh,
and that's run by
on the nose, don't you think?
well, it's run by the Master Cloner.
Okay. Got it. Okay, interesting. Well, I have some guesses as to what he might do. I've already seen, what was it, Herald Village?
Yeah.
A bunch of cloning effects too. So it's definitely something that priests do.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a look at the next one.
All right, let's do it. Reckless Experimenters. This is another Death Rattle theme card.
Yep.
Death Rattle minions you play cost 3 less, but die at the end of the turn. Oh, interesting. Huh. So this is the sort of card that you want to play with cards that have powerful Death Rattle effects. So this only counts things you play, not things that are or something.
Yep. So Coffin
I
Crasher.
was gonna say we got more Coffin Crasher cards right here. If you
Sure.
want.
Cube.
Yes. Ooh, cube. Wow. Hey, I've actually played a lot of priest decks that have felt like they kind of wanted to play Carnivorous Cube, but priest not having a way to activate its own Carnivorous Cube always felt a little awkward.
Yep.
Because you play your cube and they get silenced, and that would
Yep.
feel sad. Whereas this, you know,
Turn into a chicken.
Turn into a chicken. There you go. There you go. So yeah, this is pretty interesting, and it's gonna allow you to potentially like cycle through stuff, like we saw with Deadringer with the
Yeah.
card. You could potentially play like that. That gets you another one. Gets you a loot hoarder, which gets you a loot hoarder, which gets you.
Yeah, absolutely. These die at end of turn, so you have to.
Oh, okay, right. End of
It's
turn,
not
right.
immediate,
I was
yeah,
thinking immediate initially, and I was like, boom, chain through all.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, there's less opportunity to chain it through things, but a lot of potential like neat things that you can do just to guarantee you're getting different.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you play like Obsidian Statue and then Cube it, the cube will die at end turn and give you 2 totally clean Obsidian Statues.
Oh, that's and you can cast that with this combination, right? It actually adds up. It costs you 2 for the cube and 7 for the. Oh no, 6 for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. It's as if that were intended to just
you
line
know.
up perfectly. I love this kind of card too, because this isn't the thing that's you look at it and you're like, okay, well this goes in this deck. This is exactly the thing to do. Right. It's kind of an open-ended design that you have a whole variety of different Death Rattle cases that you might be able to use with this card.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the Boomsday Project. It's one of the things I really like is that there's these cards that are weird and experimental and you're not exactly sure how to combine them together.
Kind of like science. Just a bunch of
Exactly.
weird experimental stuff. You want to figure out ways to combine different things to get different results.
Exactly.
Well, I'm definitely excited to experiment with the experimenter because it certainly seems it can do some really interesting things.
Yeah, she's really cool. She's a lot of fun.
Will be purged.
Well, let's see what else would be fun. Next card, Faithful Lumi. 1 cost, 1/1 mech. Battle cry with a friendly mech +1/+1. So is this like kind of the snow flipper penguin like vein of you gotta have some tiny cute minion that you reveal?
Yeah, this card's adorable. This was like very early concepting was what are the cute things that Dr. Boom has around. And Faithful Lumi was just a little light bulb.
Apparently for the light bulb turned off. There it is.
There it is.
But keeps coming out.
Yeah, and it's the cute, adorable thing, and there's like thousands of these in Boom Labs, and they're just running around helping out all the other men. Dr. Boom's little assistants.
Okay, but they don't seem nearly as nefarious as Dr. Boom. They seem kind of friendly and helpful. They just light the way for you.
Exactly. They give your mics bonuses.
I mean, frankly, this can also be a reasonable card to put into a mech-focused deck.
Absolutely, it's like a 1 mana teacher.
And oh yeah, it can work. It can't work in itself though.
It can't. No.
It's battle cry, not the board.
Yep.
But it's obviously like not quite full hunter level of
Sure.
power in terms of synergy. But can definitely add up.
Yeah, you can help out.
But mostly cute. I would say.
Mostly cute.
All right. Well, I don't know if the next one's cute. Mega Agent. So this is a mega card.
This is?
So this is one of the mega. Mega initiative. Not a mega project. The other ones are projects.
Yeah, these are the Omega cards.
Okay.
This is like the ultimate science fantasy of Dr. Boom. What are